And then after the last ice age, shingle was pushed, which had been pushed in with the ice, was left there as the water receded and the sea level was much further offshore. And this shingle bank that was left behind is what then formed a barrier across the Lee and trapped fresh water coming in. And so we have this particularly fragile road that goes across the Lee, and it's on this continuously moving shingle bank. So in the early 20th century, Torcross was a really popular tourist destination, and you had promenades were built around Limpet Rocks itself, and it was also a staging post for the stagecoach which ran from Dartmouth to Kingsbridge. And lots of tourists came. They had the paddle steamer actually stopped in at Torcross that came from Kingsbridge and Dartmouth. So you had lots of people coming and going and visiting the area. You also had obviously the growing visitors meant that more and more people were coming, and to cater for them, you had the tourist businesses started to come up. So the Crowing Cock Tea Rooms was a large tea room which was at the end of where the cottages and houses are on the promenade now at Torcross. There was shower banks full of visitors that would come and visit the seaside, to take tea in the cafe, and generally enjoy the countryside around that area. And that picture was actually in 1928.
I occasionally had trouble where the volume thinks it's
Can you mute that person?
Working on this.
So down at the middle of Stapton Lee, where the middle car park is now in the memorial, there was a hotel called the Royal Sands Hotel, and that was primarily there for people who came to enjoy sport on the Lee. So I've seen records of the numbers of wildfowl that were shot on various sort of shooting expeditions, and it was hundreds and hundreds of wildfowl shot there. But the Lee was used for the sport for the hotel, and the hotel was fairly big. It had stables and a lounge and a billiard room, and I think 13 bedrooms, so it's quite a large hotel. And then down at the far end of the Lee, at the street gate end, there was the Street Manor Hotel. That hotel's not there anymore. The bits of the walled garden are still there, and the road that you can see just in the middle of the picture is the road that now goes into Streetgate car park. So before World War II, between World War I and World War II, there was obviously lots of concern about what was going on in Eastern Europe with Germany, and the government was denying that war was imminent, but Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, or Monty, he was pressing for a combined forces amphibious landing exercise to be held in that summer. It was the first of its kind since 1915. He was concerned about what was going on and felt that this exercise was necessary. So in July 1938, a year before World War II started, Slapton Sands was used as a site to run the military exercise. The subsequent choice of Slapton Sands as a location for the D-Day training in 1943 was largely due to Monty, who noticed the similarities in the topography of this area to Normandy's Utah Beach. So this is a picture of the soldiers looking on from the Street Manor part of the Lee. They were watching the combined forces exercises near to Street Manor Hotel. And this is some pictures of the combined forces exercise that was happening. So remember, this was a whole year before the war actually started. Start Bay, once the war was declared, Start Bay actually started preparing for war itself, and the beaches were covered with barbed wire to try and hamper invading forces, as was much of the coast along the English Channel, and there was strategic placing of mines. Obviously, it didn't stop the people who wanted to use the beach, but it looks a very different time to now, or indeed when the tourists were visiting years before. Start Point Lighthouse was also camouflaged at that time because they wanted to try to avoid any major landmarks to help the enemy pinpoint where they were on the coast. In 1939, the BBC built the transmitters at Start Point to relay what was called the Western programme. The northern mast was a radiator and the southern mast was the reflector. So basically the signal was given out, but instead of it all going out to sea, it was reflected back inland. So you got good coverage for the West Country and southern England. Later that year, the BBC research engineers were experimenting to see if broadcasts could be made out to sea and over to France, but without providing any navigational radio beacons for the enemy aircraft. This transmitter went on to play a really important part in D-Day. In May 1944, it was closed down and the mast functions were swapped over. So they actually made the reflector on the landward side send the transmission out over to France. The transmitter powers increased and staff were just told it was in readiness for transmitting a forces programme. But what they didn't realise were coded messages were sent in part of the conversations during the broadcasts to the Allied forces in France. Start Point was actually the only transmitter that transmitted the Allied Expeditionary Forces programme from the UK. And later on, relay stations in France and Germany sent it on ahead as the Allied forces advanced. From June 1940, pillboxes and gun emplacements, ammunition stores and observation points were built all around our coast and countryside. And these were built using detailed instructions given out by the government. So there was about 7 rough designs that they could use, but they also really advised people to try to use some of the local materials to conceal the pillboxes and other field defences around the coast. And there's some really good examples of this in Torcross. So this picture here shows the it's actually a postcard, but it shows really well, if you can see in where it's circled, you can see the actual observation point, which sadly isn't there anymore. That bit of land's eroded away, but that was the observation point on the top. And you can also, just down to the right of the circle, you can see the pillbox on the Torcross side. This is the pillbox, which is down the other side of Limpet Rocks, so just in the cove, the other side. You can see it's actually been made from concrete, but then clad with the local stone. So it does blend in really well from the coast side. It's now actually the overflow for the lee comes out underneath it. This one shows the pillbox, which was just shown on the circled postcard just now. So again, you can only just pick out the kind of black letterbox on the hillside there, but again, completely clad in local stone. And then just behind that pillbox and up a little bit, you can see this building here, which was an ammunition store. And as part of a project in 2013 that was funded with the South West Coast Path, we did some clearance work to actually uncover the buildings and tried to make sure that everything was in a good state, because we are sadly losing a lot of our World War II buildings from that time. So war finally reached Start Bay. Enemy fighters and bombers were overflying to Plymouth because of the strategic dockyards there. The coastal villages were relatively unscathed, with only occasional raids hitting home. On the 27th of November, however, 1940, a German bomb was dropped in the yard behind Harwood's shop in the village. The family did survive, but the building was flattened. And I did read something quite interesting where they were saying, although the bomb actually knocked the walls out, because it was a thatched roof, the whole kind of thing just fell. The roof fell down them, and they said it was like being encased in a tea cozy. And then obviously you had land girls coming in and working on the farm around the area because the young men had been conscripted. Beesands was less fortunate because a bomb hit a house next to the Cricket Inn and did kill 7 people. And the other thing that changed in the area was we had lots of evacuees arriving. So 65 evacuees joined the just 40 local children at Huckham, which was the local primary school. The blackouts were enforced, the home guards were set up. So the whole area started to change quite dramatically, even though they weren't suffering as much as some of the neighbouring areas like Plymouth. Then we had the evacuation. So on November the 4th in 1943, the chair of Devon County Council received a call from the War Cabinet, and he was told that the parishes behind Slapton Beach were to be evacuated by the 20th of December. So this map shows the area that was to be evacuated at the time. It was 30,000 acres to be cleared at parts of 6 parishes with 3,000 people and 180 farms. On the 12th of November, public meetings were held and the residents were then given notice, and they were just given 6 weeks to leave. The plan was it would be for about 6 months, but they knew it would take longer than that to clear up after they had actually left. The people who lived here had to move everything. They had to move pets, crops, livestock. Assistance was given with finding accommodation elsewhere and completing the threshing or lifting the root vegetables in the fields. But this, there was a lot of livestock then going onto the market, and they didn't perhaps reach the prices they might have reached ordinarily. And they were given help moving their goods, but one person reported that because they didn't go on holiday and didn't really plan on moving, they didn't actually have very much to move their stuff in. So there was all kinds of tractors and trailers and farm vehicles and vans were brought in to try and help people move. The families were told to leave their houses, lock the doors, hand in the keys with a label on it, and then go somewhere else. And many of those people sadly never came back. But they did it, and they did it because they knew it was for a good cause. And also, I suppose, at the back of their mind was if the enemy actually invaded, they wouldn't have had any warning or any time to take their personal belongings with them at all. Portable treasures were removed from the 6 parish churches, and this is a rood screen that was taken from Black Orton Church. Things they couldn't take, they tried to protect them as best they could with sandbags. The evacuation of this land around Slapton Sands was needed to conduct rehearsals on a massive scale for the long-anticipated landings into occupied Europe, D-Day. There were 2 armies working on these exercises and the subsequent D-Day, the British and the American, and obviously they had different ways of managing their troops, different uniforms, different ways of behaving. So it was a huge exercise to undertake. The different armies were assigned to different beaches, and Slapton was codenamed Utah Beach and was assigned to the Americans. The first American arrivals were on the 16th of August 1943, and more came in November after that. This was before the local communities were even informed about the evacuation, so the American troops started arriving before they actually left. And they did, there's stories that they got on very well. The locals often benefited from the generosity of the visitors. The children had sweets for the first time in a lot of months, and they actually said quite often sometimes tins of meat and fruit and wrapped parcels of bacon were on people's doorsteps in the morning. These pictures were taken actually of some local children from Slapton and Street area, and they were sent back to America to show the families how the soldiers were being made welcome. This is a picture of some of the American soldiers enjoying a pint in the local pub with the residents of the village. And there was a booklet that was actually given to the US troops with a guide to the British, so that to try and help them fit in with our quaint customs. And it's very funny reading on quite what they thought of us at that time. So eventually 30,000 American troops, the infantry, artillery, engineers, medical personnel, and tank battalions took part in the exercises, and 16 million tons of equipment and supplies descended on Devon shores for rehearsal exercises and for D-Day. The first rehearsal was called Duck 1, and it was carried out in January 1944. Over the next 5 months, there were almost continuous exercises. We had exercise fox, rat, beaver, trousers. Each one was larger than the one before, and it culminated in exercise tiger and exercise Fabius. And this picture just shows the extent of the exercises that this many ships were actually in Start Bay at the time. The Allied commander Eisenhower, he felt that the men needed to be hardened to real battle conditions. So he ordered live ammunition to be used in the later exercises. So this was, it did bring about a lot more casualties on the ground, and it must have been absolutely terrifying for the soldiers who were taking part in these exercises. And this is a picture of the remains of the Royal Sands Hotel, which you saw earlier. It was hit by shells and artillery. There are some stories that it was blown up by a stray dog who set off a mine, but I'm not absolutely sure that's true. Targets on the beach and further back were attacked by fighter bombers from the air, and naval vessels were firing from the sea. So the whole area was really damaged quite heavily around the coast. The infantry would secure the beachhead, then men and equipment were landed to continue fighting inland. So this was the way they were practicing for the actual D-Day landings themselves. And although some of the tanks were driven off the ramps of the landing ships directly onto the beach, some were launched well out to sea, so they didn't endanger the landing craft. To make the Sherman tanks amphibious, a canvas apron was put up on metal supports, and the tank actually floated just below the water, the surface of the water. So the crew were, it must have been terrifying, the crew were inside their tanks under the water with this canvas curtain around them, and they did apparently remain dry as long as the waves didn't splash over the top. So this is the picture of one of the landing ships, LSTs, unloading directly onto the beach. Some pictures of the soldiers practicing with the tanks, and just I was incredibly struck by just how young those lads look in that picture there. This is a picture to show that the engineers also needed to practice their skills. So they would build Bailey bridges or pontoons across the Lee because they knew that there was similar issues when they would arrive in Normandy with getting across rivers or lakes. So they actually needed to be able to transport their tanks over. So they also used the Lee to practice these things on. Slapton Sands suffered heavy losses before the 6th of June invasion, not only because of the live ammunition that they were using, but also one particular tragedy during Exercise Tiger. So Exercise Tiger was a 9-day exercise, and the LSTs were used to deploy tanks and equipment onto Slapton Sands. So they set off from Plymouth, Dartmouth and Brixham, where they were moored, and wound their way slowly across Lyme Bay to mimic the similar time it would take them to actually cross the channel. The first troops would arrive in the morning of the 27th of April. In the darkness of the very early morning of the next day, the 28th of April, 9 German E-boats attacked 8 LSTs, which were poorly guarded. Torpedoes hit 3 of them, 2 of them sunk, and 1 limped back to Dartmouth. And this is a picture of that LST that managed to get back in. 749 American soldiers died in that Exercise Tiger tragedy, many more than the actual landings at Utah Beach, but at the time, because of the secrecy, and they didn't want the Germans to know about the D-Day plans, they actually had to keep it really quiet. So the survivors were threatened with court-martial if they talked about it until after D-Day. Oh, I've already used that slide, but there you go. That's the extent of the exercise again, all the ships out into the sea. I'm sorry about that. a local lady, there's some really lovely reminiscence videos on our website from some of the people who lived in Slapton and Street and Torcross that we recorded as part of our 50th anniversary in 2010. And they were children at the time of the evacuation. And so one of them said that she remembers that waking up one night and hearing a distant rumble and thinking it was thunder. Then when they got up the next morning, they discovered that every vehicle, every jeep, every tank had gone and the fields were once again deserted. And then about 2 days later, the news of the invasion of the Normandy coast was heard on the wireless. So all the equipment and vehicles were loaded up onto the LSTs in Dartmouth and Salcombe and other harbours along the coast. This is one of the American soldiers driving or directing the vehicles onto the ship. Once they're all loaded up, they all then left off for France. And this is actually Dartmouth, so you can see quite how the scale of the operation, how many vehicles and troops were stationed around that area. And the harbour's literally just emptied overnight. So again, this is Dartmouth with the tanks there, the ships ready to go. And you can see all the barrage balloons and in the air there to try and stop the enemy aircraft from coming too close. So D-Day itself was the 6th of June, 1944, and the men that trained on Slapton Beach and in the evacuated area were engaged in the attack on Utah and Omaha beaches. So you can see it made what went on in Slapton and around our area just made up one part of the whole D-Day plans, with troops coming from all around the south coast of England and Wales and around on the east of England. This is some pictures which I managed to find showing the actual D-Day landings in France. And I was just really struck by how normal it all looks on the beach and how it's, I don't know, I suppose in my mind it was going to look a bit like Slapton, whereas actually it doesn't. It's just a town with people living there and things going on, but so there's the soldiers all coming in and bringing their bikes, and as well as all the equipment coming in to land on the beaches. And then this one just shows again the scale of the operation. So you had so many ships unloading, tanks, troops, vehicles onto the beach, and then as soon as that boat left, the next one would come in to drop their load off as well. So obviously all that went on, and while all that was going on, then there was the plans were made for returning the area back to the residents of the villages. So the area was formally handed back to the government and a bomb disposal unit was sent in. They went from the perimeter towards the beach, which was the worst hit part of the area. And their aim was being that they hoped that the farmers could be back in time for autumn sowing. There were plagues of rats and seagulls reported scavenging on food remains and the unharvested crops which were left in the ground. The government paid for repairs to be carried out to roads and buildings and fences. And although they did post sentries around the perimeter to try and keep the anxious householders out, sadly, there are accounts show that looters still managed to get in, and quite a lot of people went back to their houses and things were taken out of the roofs where they'd left them, or lots of reports of brass items being stolen from the houses after the Americans had left, so door handles and letterboxes and light poles. So it must have been absolutely hideous to come back and see quite what was left behind. Street Manor and the Royal Sands Hotel were too badly damaged and had to actually be demolished. Stokenham Church and the Church House Inn at Stokenham were also badly damaged, but Torcross seemed remarkably undamaged. When the residents came back in, they received gifts that were sent by the American and Canadian Red Cross. And I just love I wonder who made the list about what they were actually going to get, because they generally got a 6 to 8 cup teapot. So they obviously decided that they knew just what we liked in a time of crisis, was cups of tea. So they got that bit right. They had a patchwork quilt pair bed, a kettle, just 2 dinner plates. Even though they could make tea for 8, they only had 2 for dinner, a sweeping brush and a broom and a scrubbing brush, a galvanized bucket, a thick doormat, and a picture of the King and Queen. So I'm sure once they had all of that given to them, they were fine. This is a picture of some of the ladies receiving their gifts, and some of the children of the village getting theirs down the bottom. So everything that had gone on during Exercise Tiger and during the evacuation was obviously secret. Nobody knew quite what had happened, and certainly didn't know the full extent of the tragedy of Exercise Tiger, because it was all still covered by Official Secrets Act, and so the soldiers obviously were told not to talk about it. The people who died were actually just the deaths were recorded as part of the D-Day landings. They were never recorded as happening here in Slapton. On the 24th of June in 1954, a monument was presented by the US Army in gratitude to the people of the South Hams, who, and they said, generously left their homes and their lands to provide a battle practice area. So this is the monument, which is now in the middle car park down at Slapton. And so it was really significant that the American soldiers and the American Army only put a monument as a memorial to thank the people who'd evacuated. There was still no mention of the American soldiers that had died. A local man from Torcross, Ken Small, discovered what he thought was a tank lying on the seabed just offshore from Torcross. This was in the mid-70s. I think there'd been various reports of something being down there, and he had been beachcombing and found lots of shells and ammunitions on the beach. And he had been talking to people about the evacuation and the practice that went on during wartime, and was really interested to see quite what this was under the sea. He did manage to persuade some of his diver friends to actually go and check, and they confirmed that it was indeed a tank. Ken went on to actually purchase the tank from the US government, and he was finally able to bring it ashore in 1984, so 10 years after he first discovered it there. When it was pulled out of the water, they thought that the tracks were all rusted solid because it had been under sea so long, but they pulled it up the beach, and once it actually hit the slipway going up onto the promenade, the running gear started turning just as freely as it had in 1944. During Exercise Tiger, we know that this tank disembarked from a landing craft without its waterproof engine plate in place. It was one of the swimming tanks, they called them, that I was talking about earlier, where they had this canvas surround to the tank. So that picture there, you can see the tank would have sat just below the water, and that large canvas area would have been sticking up out of the water to try and keep the tank dry. But without this waterproof engine plate, the water got in underneath, and it sank in 65 foot of water, just about 3/4 of a mile offshore. Ken Small worked with South Hams District Council and set the tank up as a memorial to those soldiers that died during Exercise Tiger, and it's still in Torcross at the moment, and is really visited by lots of people to try and understand more about the story. So I've finished earlier than I thought I would. I hope that's okay. So thank you very much for listening. So if you would like more information, there's a couple of places you can look. So on our website, southdevon.aonb.org.uk, and if you either search for Torcross Village or follow that link, you can actually see lots more information about the wartime story and other history about the area as well. Also, on our website, if you go to the walk section and scroll down to the Torcross walk, you'll see the videos that I talked about, which were made by the adults who were evacuated as children during the war. There's also the walking route. So if you actually want to follow the walk yourselves and have a look at some of the things that we've seen on these pictures, then the walking route will take you around that area. There's also some really lovely exhibitions in Dartmouth Museum, and there's archive material as well at the Kingsbridge Cookworthy Museum. And local history groups in the area quite often do talks. There is a Stokenham history group, and I know that some of the members are on here today. But many of the local history groups do fantastic talks and have lots of archives of old photos that you can browse. But also, if you have anything that you want to add, that's a great way to do that. And I just want to thank the Kingsbridge Cookworthy Museum, Dartmouth Museum, Pyrrell War Museum and Robin Rose Price for some of the photos that we've actually used today. Okay, so have we got some questions come in, Vanessa?